Good afternoon. It's just gone midday on Wednesday, the 21st of October. A very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us this afternoon to this webinar where we will be discussing the new book by Anton Harber called So for the Record, Behind the Headlines in an Era of State Capture. This is the book. And as we were saying just before we went live, it's available in all leading bookstores and some others as well. It's also available as an e-book. My name is Franz Kruger. I'm head of the Department of Journalism, and I really look forward to discussing some of the implications of the book and its revelations for journalism more widely. As I'm sure you know, the book deals in riveting detail with the backstory of several important news stories that have attracted a great deal of attention in the past few years. Some have done so positively, specifically the way in which the Gupta leaks emerged. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that these reports reshaped the political landscape in South Africa significantly for the better. Others, unfortunately, mark a real low point in South African journalism. These were the Sunday Times reports of an alleged police death squad in Cato Manor, of illegal renditions, and of a rogue unit in the South African Revenue Service. The book does a remarkable job of unpacking how journalism works in a way that reminded me of Janet Malcolm's very well-known The Journalist and the Murderer. It's also a rattling good tale, though often an uncomfortable read for a journalist. So joining me is firstly Anton Harber, the author, who's also my colleague in Wits Journalism, Pippa Green, who is the press ombud, and Professor Tawana Kupe, who is not only the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, as you can see behind him there, but also a renowned media scholar. Please do join in. Questions or points can be made in the chat or in the Q&A. We've got some ground to cover that I think suggests itself, but we'd very much like to have your participation in the discussion. Anton, let me start with you. What do you feel is the key takeaway on why things go wrong? You outline a number of factors that combine to cause the Sunday Times to become the dupes of deceivers, the phrase you borrow from Tio Soga. You describe the deliberate manipulation that saw dubious dossiers fed to the paper, among others. Can I just say that the one disappointment I had in the book is that I really wanted to see the smoking gun, but I guess that was just too hard to find. You talk of systemic issues, newsrooms reduced in size and capacity because of the business crisis, and an arrogant culture that could not admit mistakes. What was the main problem in your view?
Yeah, Franz, you're quite right that I try and look at it at a number of levels. The individuals involved, where they went wrong, the practice and culture in the Sunday Times newsroom, and then what was happening in the media industry as a whole that was creating the kinds of pressures that were taking place. And of course, there's the political scenario, and I tease out as best I can those who were deliberately setting out to mislead the Sunday Times. But they were trying to mislead a number of newspapers, so the question is, why did the Sunday Times fall for it? And I would highlight the practices and culture that had developed in the newsroom based on an incredible arrogance about the power they had wielded as South Africa's biggest, richest newspaper. Without realizing that social media had undermined that power and made them much more vulnerable. But I highlight practices such as what I call the Sunday Times treatment was the way they treated a story and took out all the qualifiers that we journalists use, like claimed and alleged and quotation marks. And in that process of editing, turned claims into facts and allegations into what appeared to be truths. And there are many aspects of the practice in the Sunday Times that really led them astray. But I think the root, it happens within the context of the paper under financial pressure and therefore desperate for the big front page splash, which was so critical to their strategy.
I mean, situating the problem so squarely in that particular newsroom, and you talk about a culture of arrogance there, doesn't that let the rest of us off the hook too easily? I mean, aren't there things to be learnt about journalism as a whole? I mean, saying that this was a problem in that particular newsroom basically suggests that that's something over there which the rest of us don't need to worry about.
I'm certainly not suggesting that the problem is only at the Sunday Times. It was particularly acute at the Sunday Times, and they fell for the tricksters who were trying to deceive them and lead them up the wrong path, whereas others didn't. So one has to ask what it was there. But many of the things I highlight in the newspaper, particularly the impact of social media, the impact of financial pressure, and cutting corners in order to get the big splash, are happening on many publications. There's no question.
So Johan van Lochrenberg, who plays a central role in the events and appears prominently in your book, who was hurt particularly badly by the stories around SARS, asked at the launch of the book the other day why journalism doesn't take these issues much more seriously. If I remember correctly, and I don't remember his exact turn of phrase, but what I do remember is that you essentially responded to him by saying, that's a good question. Well, but what's the answer? I mean, shouldn't we be, I mean, why don't we take these things more seriously?
Well, we do have a self-regulatory system, which Pippa will talk about. She represents it here. And in fact, it's my view that it came through this experience reasonably well, because it was their rulings that started to unwind the Sunday Times stories. There's a series of 3 rulings that were devastating for the Sunday Times. I'm hoping my book will be saying we need to and we must pay more attention to making ourselves account from within journalism. And accepting a new accountability, a new transparency, a new sense of responsibility. I'm hoping that's one of the impacts of the book, to get journalists thinking and talking about that factor.
The kind of criticism that van Lochrenberg expresses was at the heart of political pressure a few years back that sought to create what the ANC then called a media tribunal. I think that resolution is still sitting somewhere, though thankfully that debate has gone pretty quiet. But it is true that I think many people still feel that journalists get off far too lightly. People's reputations are ruined and all they get is an apology. I mean, as Anton says, you're the Ombud, you're responsible for deciding where journalists have crossed the line. Doesn't this book show that the system of self-regulation isn't muscular enough, that it's not really working?
Well, you know, it's quite embarrassing for a newspaper to have to publish an apology at all. There's no monetary fine, but it does take valuable editorial space as well as reputational damage to publish an apology. And in this case, in all 3 rulings, van Lochrenberg, Ivan Pillay, and Pravin Gordhan, the Sunday Times was ordered to publish an apology above the fold on page 1 and to retract the stories, which was I think, you know, probably one of the more serious sanctions that one can mete out. You know, I don't know what the alternative is to self-regulation, because as you say, it's something, then you have a kind of move into sort of punitive criminal terrain. And I don't think that that is very good for freedom of expression. I don't think that fines are very good for freedom of expression. That said, that the difference between journalism and an artist, say, is that journalism has to be accountable, so that you can have your freedom of expression is tempered by your professional obligations. And I think that what Anton has shown as well, and that is about the, you know, for me, the most important professional obligation comes from Kovacs and Rosensteel book, which is the discipline of verification, is that we kind of get swept away by what I call grand narratives. And if something kind of fits into a grand narrative, sometimes you don't bother to check the details. In this case, there was a grand narrative that was driven politically, I believe. I don't think that it's been shown otherwise. But in other cases that have crossed my desk, you know, people who are considered kind of unpopular or bad, you know, for instance, the Alf Lekau, the pastor from the Alleluia Ministries, who brought 2 complaints to this office. Now, you'll remember that he was the guy who resurrected the Zimbabwean man in the coffin about sometime early last year. and was all over the place on the news. And there were stories about him that were very serious by City Press, and actually a lot of it was right. But the problem is that some of the details weren't checked, and I hated to have to make a ruling about this at the time. But because some of the details weren't checked, for instance, not all the allegations were put to him. Often they were put to him way too late, as happened in the Rogue Unit stories. They kind of put allegations like, you know, sources say that you are, you know, inspired by demons who persuade you to have, you know, that the lustful demons are your inspiration. Please answer by 5 p.m. This was kind of 4 p.m., you know, on a Saturday afternoon. I think that when the more serious a story, as in this case, the more care you have to take to allow somebody the right of reply, and the more care you have to take not to fall into a grand narrative trap. But I do think that self-regulation works. It's difficult, it's not ideal, but I don't know if there are ideal alternatives.
I mean, the expectation is often that a system like self-regulation would prevent things going wrong. Can it do that?
Yeah, often, you know, what we do kind of with self-regulation is to try and speak to newsrooms fairly regularly and journalists. Not as regularly as we would like. It depends on how many complaints are on the desk. And we go through the most common transgressions and give examples of rulings that are all on our website anyway. I'm not sure whether editors read the rulings, but if one does that, one can learn quite a lot. But we try to do education and discussions and this kind of thing as a form of prevention, if you like, as a form of how not to go wrong. But that said, you know, we face other problems today. Newspapers are incredible, and publications, I'll talk about the media generally, are incredibly stressed, not only financially, but by the competition of Twitter and the internet, social media. So the pressure to be first becomes more urgent and mistake. A lot of the complaints, for instance, from the Sunday Sun, the reporters have picked up stories, these celebrity type stories from Instagram. Now, if you're not on Instagram, they won't mean anything, but they become quite big stories, and the people who are the subjects of them get, you know, have complained. I think I've had 3 or 4 complaints based on Instagram stories. So to be fair to the newspapers, they are under that kind of pressure, that kind of competition and financial stress. And at the same time, I also think that it's, as in any period, it's really important to stick to the principles. And you know what, Anton's, as much as it was important during the Rogue Unit, Cato Manor Death Squad stories, it's really important now because we are also fed with loads of misinformation.
Sure, thanks. I mean, Anton points out in an article that appeared earlier this week in Business Day that one of the real challenges to the system has been that significant players, one thinks of independent newspapers, for instance, aren't part of the system, have pulled out of the system. Is this an inevitable trend, you think, Pippa, or is there hope that we might get back to a system that really covers all of journalism in this country?
You know, independent newspapers pulled out on the reason they gave in 2016 was that we had, the Press Council had abolished the waiver. The waiver is something, for those who don't know, that you sign, that you used to have to sign to say that you won't sue, that you won't take legal action. But when Justice Lange presided over the Press Freedom Commission in 2013, they dropped that on the grounds that everyone should have the constitutional right to access to a court. In reality, of the 500 complaints odd that we've had a year since 2013, so times that by 7, you have 6.5, the number of people who've actually sued have been 3. And the number of people of those 3 who've actually won have been 0. I mean, one case was settled out of court. One person settled for an apology from the reporter, not even the editor. And the other person sort of took it, third person took it halfway and then dropped it. So, you know, it's not, the reason we exist is to allow the public, because courts are expensive, etc., and an easy way to resolve complaints or what might be unfairness. But to pull out on that pretext didn't seem to make sense given the number of people who sued. There had been, I should point out, a number of cases against Independent, including by the dismissed editor of the Cape Times, Alida Danois, who brought cases to the press ombud, my predecessor, where Independent lost. I hope that that's not the reason for them pulling out. It would be a pity because everyone loses or wins in this system. But they pulled out shortly after losing a series of cases about the controversy around the firing of Alida Danois and a number of the Cape Times staff. So yes, it's a problem that the biggest English language group is not part of us. It's a problem that there's no independent ombud to adjudicate complaints that are about independent newspapers, and we do get a lot of complaints about independent newspapers. I can't do anything about them because they go to an internal person there who tries to settle them.
Thank you. I actually see, I think that Alida Danois is in the audience. I do want to remind people that if you have points or questions, please do throw them into the chat or into the Q&A section. Tawana, let me turn to you. I mean, in South Africa, we have the Press Council. We have media criticism that sometimes comes in the form of a tweet, sometimes in the form of a book, sometimes is reasonable and sometimes less so. But what ultimately can we assume would guarantee a trustworthy media, do you think? You're muted.
Sorry, I was muted this end of the year. I was muted. Unmute yourself. And
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, it's a question that you actually asked. So media, especially news media, well, in essence, all media need the trust of their audiences. And that should, if you like, not be compromised at all. But I think what I like about what Anton said just now and what is a reflection of his book is that he sees a confluence of factors that cause this. It's not just the individual journalist. An individual works in an organizational context with a particular culture, but that organization and these cultures are subject to external pressures. But from a trust integrity point of view, from a media journalistic ethics point of view, you must have mechanisms to make sure those pressures do not unduly damage the trust and integrity you have with your audience. But I think that Anton did say, he mentioned the word systemic, and I think you did too when you first opened the first question to him. There have been a lot of systemic changes and pressures, if you like, affecting the media and communications industry more broadly, happening over decades. I like to call this a period and the age of disruptions and crises. So if I was still had the privilege to teach, I would prescribe Anton's book to be read my media theory students as an example or in a particular theoretical trend we call critical political economy of the media, which is what influences and pressures affect the media and how does the media respond and how does it affect their role in relation to society. So how do they maintain trust in these conditions? The way I read the book and the way I've listened to debates on, one particular thing was under stress. The fact checking was under stress. And obviously, if people want to influence the media externally, want their own facts or what is called alternative facts these days. The role of the media or the role of journalists in the newsroom is to have robust fact-checking mechanisms to ensure the anti-embarrassments that Pippa is talking about. That seems in this particular context and in many others beyond the Sunday Times has failed. But it fails, as Anton says, because there's another big disruptor, which also, if you like, peddles facts of its own kind, the social media, the technological disruptions. And these technological disruptions are not just about facts. They are also disrupting the funding model, if you like, the financing model, and putting it under immense pressure. So aren't we really here talking about an industry, a profession, and these practices that are in an age that have been so disrupted, are being so disrupted? Their traditional mechanisms won't be sufficient. So you might have a self-regulation, but if you have people existing outside self-regulation, including the alternative media, the social media, how useful is social self-regulation going to be? which is not to say it's not necessary. We need all of the mechanisms to ensure trust and integrity, as your question demands. But also we need to make sure that they are fit for purpose times that are actually changing. And what must not change, for example, is factualness, integrity, honesty, and because the media and journalists exist, if you like, to advance a fundamental human right, freedom of expression, and that expression must be as truthful as possible.
So let me ask you to take that line of thought just one or two steps further. I mean, you talk about the profound disruption that the media are experiencing and journalism. And you're saying also that one of the things that remain constant are trust, or the need for trust and the need for a measure of integrity. What might that look like in I don't know whether there will be a post-disrupted world, but
yeah.
Stage of what journalism might appear like on the landscape. What might those mechanisms look like?
I like that question because although I might look young, I'm preparing for my post-retirement life. And my post-retirement life, I'll run a consultancy called Reimagine. So reimagine things. So I've written a paper recently about reimagining universities. But more seriously, I'm serious about this in that what you're asking us to do is to reimagine a media industry for a society which is different from when the media emerged. And remember also, let's not actually be romantic about this. If you go back into media history and media sociology, there were periods like this in the life of the media, where whole-scale disinformation and also telling lies and not being truthful were true. Some of it is often called propaganda. Yes, it was during before and so on. And also industry, the many centuries have had multiple transformations, if you like. So we are at a period of major transformation now. How would that look like? Let me say, step out of the media for a minute and get back. The one thing that has always been weak in this is society's own understanding of the workings of the media. I like books like Anton's book because for people who read the books that are written by Anton and others, it exposes the inner workings, which most of the public don't understand. And also because there has to be an understanding of how the media works and how it ought to work by the generality of the public for them to understand where things go wrong and how things ought to be. So one of the things I'm going to be suggesting in reimagining is greater critical media and information literacy, understanding how these things work, because that is able to also discern from like propaganda, misinformation. Because remember, we have to understand the social media are not going to go away, and they are not under Pippa's control or Pippa's oversight. They're not under the trusted journalists, the ethical journalists we want. So the public now needs to discern fact from not just opinion as in the past, fact from things that are not actually facts, that are actually lies, be able to trace what is the source and origin of this and whether this is plausible or not. That cannot be done by the media alone. The media can, if you like, ethical media should continue to be honest and so on. But understanding that the media is now a broader thing, there are even something called citizen journalism, which some of us actually do teach in our newsrooms. And citizen journalists are not necessarily the journalists that might fall under Pippa's oversight. So I think that what it would look like really is a greater understanding of the information and communication landscape. And that has to be taught all the way from grade 1 up to university, if you like. Then the people we draw in as journalists will be coming from that kind of society. I would also put a plug in what I know the department does, having been at Wits for many years and ran the other department. And Anton and I studied on the same day, if you like, and worked very closely together. Types of departments that teach critical journalism and critical media studies are even more important today than in the past, because this thing needs to be taken apart, if you like, and understood for what it is. And books like what Anton actually does. Then the public can write also, where does self-regulation take us, and what do you do when self-regulation cannot go that far? Because by nature, you can't force people into a self-regulatory thing. because it's voluntary by nature. And the problem always, it's not the problem. People must understand that is often done because freedom of expression does not actually belong to journalists and the media. Freedom of expression belongs to the public, right? It's a fundamental human right. Journalists and the media are the most appropriate mechanisms for actually us realizing our freedom of expression. But they can fail, especially in periods of transitions. And even in good times, it is not as if we do not have scandals that are very seriously damage people's credibility. And then, of course, now we also live in a fancy academic way. Politics, information, media, and many things in society these days are heavily contested. And many societies now have like serious fault lines, and even major political parties. South Africa is not immune. The ANC's ruling party is routinely spoken about these days nicely as a party of factions. And even the president and the other factions will talk about factions. And also factions normally live on alternative facts, or they want only their facts to be put on the door. So that also is beyond the role of what a newsroom can control, although a newsroom should try and bring to the public greater light into what factions stand for and where the truth lies, which might not be with both factions. So I think that we have to reimagine a society where there's greater consensus about where to go as a society. There's a more agreement about what is factual about the social situation, and also there's a media probing all of those things and pushing for new boundaries. In essence, if you like, we have to reimagine a new kind of society with completely different institutions, including academic institutions, and how we train journalists ourselves.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, building that consensus, building that common ground is going to take some doing. But we're in the general area of thinking of solutions. And Anton, your column earlier this week ended up with, I think, 5 or 6 points, almost like a recipe. Here's what we need to do. Just take us through those points of where you feel the solution to this crisis, where these solutions lie. Just unmute yourself.
Sorry. Certainly, France, I'll try and remember all of them. But the first one was that we need to return to the notion of journalism as public service, not just a commercial enterprise, not about chasing sensation, but in serving the public. And that core value is one we must reaffirm. But I also think we need a rethinking of some of the practices. I mean, I think Tawana has spoken forcibly about our need to reimagine how we do journalism in a society that's going through considerable change in its communications. And I think that's a very important point. I mean, one point I would like to highlight is that we've referred today to newspapers that stay out of the self-regulatory system. And in fact, it's not a coincidence that those same newspapers are those who've rehired some of the journalists that messed up at the Sunday Times, and particularly those who are unrepentant, who don't acknowledge that things went wrong even now. And I think there needs to be social pressure and professional pressure in the industry to say that these are rogue newspapers now, and that we must make the public and advertisers aware that if they're backing those newspapers, then they're undermining our democracy. I think it's that serious. So, you know, that's something in particular I think we need to discuss as journalists. That's
quite a recommendation. And I'd really like to hear Pippa and Tawana's response to that. I see there's a comment here from Isak Minar, and we'll get back to that. But Pippa, I mean, what Anton is saying is that people who messed up, we shouldn't talk to them anymore. They should be sent into Coventry. They should be their own rogue unit, and they should be excluded from the circle of civilized conversation. Would you go along with that?
You see, it's very hard in this profession to be, what is the word, to have kind of mandatory sanctions like that. You have to persuade people. I mean, I agree with the sentiment, but I really don't know how we do it. But you have pointed out in an article, in one of your pieces, that the currency of journalism is trust. And Anton's article in Business Day and Kovach and Rosenthal say, you know, the three most important elements of journalism. Journalism's first obligation is to the truth. Its first loyalty is to citizens, and its essence is a discipline of verification. What I think that what we have to do is to distinguish ourselves, you know, on those grounds, to distinguish journalism on those grounds from every other bit of misinformation that's out there. Tawana, that's why I hate the term citizen journalist. It's something that comes from talk radio. You know, everyone is a journalist. I don't, you know, if I've got a problem with my foot, I don't go to a citizen doctor. I'm not saying that we are, there is a debate about how professional we are and whether there is such a thing as a profession of journalism. In the old days, there weren't university degrees. People kind of went to, you know, onto the, you know, into newsrooms from school really, and just kind of learnt on the job. These days, there is more professionalism, but I think that the principles are really important. It's about verification, credibility, and accountability. And that means being accountable for what you write. So I don't think that there is a way that under self-regulation we can perhaps embrace all the Twitter users, all the people who phone into talk shows, all the people who are on community stations. You know, they might have a place, and nobody has ever suggested freedom of expression is for journalists alone. In fact, journalists have slightly less freedom of expression because they're under more discipline in terms of their work. So I think that you know, in terms of self-regulation, I think that we have to really appeal to, we have to get public trust. It's not about forcing people, it's not about forcing people to do anything, but if people know that those subscribers to the Press Council or those subscribers to the press code or to editorial codes anywhere in the world will know that there will be certain disciplines in following a story, and that if there are mistakes made, which there always are, I mean, genuine mistakes are made in the course of reporting, that there'll be some accountability.
So can I come in there, Franz?
Yes, Tawana, please go ahead.
I don't disagree with what Pippa is doing, but this is fundamentally where we are not understanding what things have happened. Journalists or the media are no longer the only people, if you like, circulating information or even news out there. The situation has changed dramatically. Even the Sunday Times has lost readers, and many major newspapers have lost readers because there are so many other media platforms. This does not put them on the same level. In my hierarchy would be, you know, what we would call professional journalism and media houses. And they still have a powerful role to play. And I agree with Anton's play, where and financing, so that they are put on a footing where the financial pressures are not. But also to ignore that there's a whole section of practices that deal with information and communication where people get their news, and to ignore the fact that the gadgets that the general public is holding, they are using to send around distorted or even real facts down to personal family stories and so on. It's also to ignore how that historically the nature of the communications industry has arisen. Remember, when newspapers started, literacy was not a widespread thing. The people who enjoyed newspapers and books and others were those who were allowed to go to school. They were men, in the northern industrialized societies, they were men, they were wealthy people, they owned slaves, plantations, and others. But as education was democratized and technologies became much more possible, radio, television, and others. And all the time over those years, some of these things were fractured and frayed. In the reimagination project, we have to think about everything. When people leave newspapers and professional media and journalists and occupy a different universe, it's not regulated by anybody. That is where they are getting their facts. The dramatic society, I think, is the United States, where you ask yourself the question, how did a society like that elect Trump? And it is some of the best newspapers, some of the best radio stations, some of the best radio programs. But still, people occupy an alternative landscape. And also something follows in that society. Some are more highly educated and know the world and some don't. the politics is contested and fractured. The economy creates an unequal society. There are many poor and unemployed people as there are billionaires that are, get even richer by the day. Or we want to create a different kind of society. We can, as far as possible, we share some common sense of information that is fairly checkable, can be trusted and is trustworthy and so on, where we are not Luddites who don't believe that new technologies can be used in a responsible fashion. So the so-called citizen journalists, I want to educate them about their responsibility in handling information and using information gathered. I want to educate them, newspapers and listen to radio stations and have diverse sources of information to form better opinion, to be better citizens, to create a better society.
I want to throw in a term that Anya Schifrin used in an article recently about trust and credibility. She talks about journalism having lost, I think the term was the emblems, the symbols, excuse me, of credibility. The signals that we send out to say this is trustworthy content, treated in a particular way. Pippa, I mean, I suppose, you know, for some people, a license would do that, right? You give people a letter that says, you're a professional journalist, you're allowed to write. Are there other new kinds of signals that we could develop that would give readers a clear sense that this is kind of professional, carefully researched, reliable information?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a press card, which, you know, we don't all have these days. You used to have in the, I mean, I remember in the kind of apartheid days when I started, but a press card would do it, but subscription to the press code, you know, which is flagged. And we, you know, the Press Council has about 500 members, over 500 members at the moment. A lot of them are small community newspapers that actually think that the standards of, you know, the disciplines of journalism, trust, accountability, verification are worth upholding. So you'll find small community newspapers in Limpopo or George or wherever who subscribe to the Press Council. That's a lot. You know, if you look at the main media organizations, there are only a handful of the big media companies, but there are a lot who want to. The big exceptions are independent, and I think Noseweek is not there. Just on the kind of, you know, what is shifting. I mean, do we embrace the shift or do we put up standards against it? There was an interesting article on the First Amendment in the New York Times, I think on Sunday, by Emily Bazelon, who's written a lot about kind of social media. And she and Maria Ressa, the Filipino editor who was arrested, have both pointed out that the new gatekeepers of news are no longer news editors or subs or what we had to deal with, but it's Facebook and Google and Twitter. And the problem is that political lobby groups capture, you know, parts of these, as we've seen here, and as certainly one has seen. Tawana asked how Trump could get elected. Well, you know, I mean, there was an interview put on Facebook by, I think, Breitbart, which we all know is a right-wing organization, which touted hydroxychloroquine as a cure for COVID-19 after the president of the United States had said that. It was viewed 20 million times before it was taken off Facebook. So you have to distinguish, journalists have to distinguish themselves as being more disciplined and being more, and that's why the subscription to the press code by a number of publications around this country is a good thing. So instead of embracing what we can't control, rather say here is a set of standards, and that we urge people who think they are journalists to try and subscribe to this set of standards.
I think that leads us to Isaac Minar's point in the chat. I mean, he's drawing attention to the fact that the recently issued draft white paper on audio and audiovisual content services proposes that in future all press and journalistic content provided over electronic communications networks, including online, should be issued with licenses administered by CASA. He asks, if this policy is approved, Pippa, where will it leave independent regulations, seeing that all media are now online?
Sorry, I was on mute. We do that media that is online are members of the Press Council and subscribe to the press code and are subject to the press code. So including broadcasters, by the way. So if the SABC puts something online or EWN puts something online, it's subject to our jurisdiction by agreement rather than the BCCSA. But I do think that it's a very important question that ISAC raises, because what we really need, and I think ISAC has been involved in working on codes in other parts of the continent, and we need an umbrella code, you know, for radio, for broadcasting news. Not the talk shows are slightly different kettle of fish, but broadcasting news and publications, because there's so much merging, both online, you know, print and broadcasting these days, so that I think that we can do that. And we also have, you know, for anyone who might be interested, you know, who's online media or broadcasting media, the copies of the code are on our website. We have it available in 4 languages now. And it's a really simple, it's the kind of stuff that, you know, you teach in journalism school or you learn in your first job when you make a mistake with a magistrate's name, as I learned on my first ever assignment as a reporter, you know, doing a court story. So it's a useful guide for credible journalism.
I mean, the proposal here seems to be that everything would have to be licensed by ICASA, which goes a little bit further than the current arrangement around the press council. And I think, I mean, that's
true. Yeah, and I'm sorry, Frans.
Go ahead, Pippa.
Well, I think that, you know, that the system of independent regulation, self-regulation, that we need to put up an argument to show that it does actually work. Our rate of compliance is very high. We've never had anyone refuse to run an apology, to my knowledge, at any rate. There is a process so that if people are unhappy with the Ombud's ruling or what the public advocate says, they can appeal to the chair of appeals, who's Judge Kupe. So there is a system that kind of works. And I think that if one had to be licensed, it would involve another level of control I'm talking kind of off the top of my head, but I think that a lot of the media might be a bit uncomfortable with that they'd be more comfortable with self-regulation.
You think that some of the media might be a little bit uncomfortable with being licensed by ICASA? I think you're putting it mildly. I think there would be significant discomfort. Tawana, you want to come into that?
I was going to say that, I mean, on grounds of, remember also the thing about the difficulty about professional journalism is that, strictly speaking, because it's connected to the freedom of expression, it is so developed that most media who are credible will employ people who are educated and have some training in journalism, but it's not necessarily a requirement. Like a doctor would be, or a psychologist, or a veterinary surgeon, or a teacher, right? And the good reason for that, there's an argument, is that an exercise of freedom of expression should not be licensed or restricted by undue requirements, if you like. We might say in this day and age, it's not an undue requirement to ask a journalist to be trained. But many journalists in the past who were good were trained with a PPE from Oxford or from a reputable university even on our continent. If you know your politics, you can write, and you write well, you check your facts, you adhere to the code, you can be a journalist. So I think we should not be really very uneasy and very, very afraid about a licensing regime by an institution that might not necessarily be that independent. So, and also I think I hear what Pippa said earlier on, but here's a problem we have, guys, is that how do we ensure that even if we create that space of credible, trusted journalists, how do we, if you like, attract audiences or readers to that space? Because the space we live in, the age we live in now, is a fall in readership. And even when the newspapers are not in transcription, when they publish retractions and apologies. Because remember that readers cannot be forced simply because we say we are credible and we're more trustworthy when the landscape is changing.
Thanks, Tawana. I just want to remind people that if you have points or questions to throw into the discussion, that would be really welcome. I've seen very many well-known names in the participants list. I can't imagine that there aren't more thoughts out there that would add to this discussion. But I'd like to bring it back a little bit more specifically to the book and to the specific stories that you tell, Anton. I mean, you and I, some years back, were part of an investigation that looked at a previous set of missteps, where it was reported by the Sunday Times, for instance, that the sea off Table Bay was being sold and various other things. You point out in your book that those recommendations were not implemented. Do you think this time around the Sunday Times has moved on sufficiently, or do you think that there's still work to be done?
I think that's a question they need to answer before we do. Yes, they fell back into the same trap, partly because they didn't fully implement the recommendations they were given to deal with it in 2007. They've taken some measures since then. You know, I think the essence of it is that when those stories got to the Ombud's person, the system then caught them, and rulings were made around those stories. But the first step should be an internal one in a paper like the Sunday Times, that they capture, that they scrutinize these stories, they do the fact checking, they go through an internal process of verification. And I think they have taken some measures, but I haven't seen a full range of measures. And look, I think it is important to say that it's a hard thing to do when you're under severe financial pressure and you're losing readers the way they are. But I would argue that to build your readership again, you have to rebuild your credibility and trust with the audience. And you do that by taking these measures. It's not a factor that the New York Times turned itself around, not by cutting, but by employing more journalists to do a proper professional job. So I don't think they've done enough, but I don't think they've done enough all in all. In the context of reimagining journalism in this changed period, and how you have to shift your practices to deal with the speed and pressures of social media, for example. So I think there is a lot for us to do, but I think some very important points have been made today. Tawana emphasized the need to have greater media awareness in the public, and do that through our educational system, for example. And I think he's absolutely right. If you don't have a critical awareness of how media and journalism works, then you're susceptible to alternative facts. For example, what about the need for journalists to deal in their profession? You know, France, you took what I said and you made it a little harsher than I said when you said we should send to Coventry anyone who breaks a rule. And of course, that's not what I'm saying. But I was highlighting journalists who don't acknowledge mistakes and problems and continue standby stories that are totally discredited. I think we should be very wary of allowing them to be associated with our work as journalists. You know, it was quite interesting what was said about citizen journalism and fake news. Anyone who's read my book will see that those are two terms I don't use. I never talk about fake news because I'm of the view that if it's fake, it's not news. It's fake, and the term is too abused by those who want to who want to label news as fake news. We all know how it's used politically, abused politically. Well, Tawana's quite right that we have to take on board the fact that citizens can communicate directly with massive other citizens in a way that looks like journalism, but I differentiate it because it doesn't fill the criteria that Pippa outlined earlier, such as verification. And therefore, you know, I think we can talk about citizen communicators, but I never talk about citizen journalists. I never use the word objective. So I think it's quite interesting that in that in a very substantial book on this topic, those are phrases I choose not even to use in any way at all.
One of the points that emerged very strongly from your argument, and I think the way in which you describe what happened, was a failure to allow for alternative narratives. And linked to that, a failure to give people adequate chance to respond. And it speaks also to Pippa's earlier point about buying into a grand narrative. You set out for yourself a framework according to which you think things work, and then everything is read in that light. Say something about how you saw that coming through in your investigation.
There's no question that what I call the Sunday Times treatment was to say, if we believe the story and we believe this particular narrative line is the right one, then stick with it. Don't allow for counter narratives. Our readers want us to present them with simple, stark stories that they can believe and trust, and don't confuse it with counter narratives. And it seems to me there's a fundamental attitude there that is wrong, that is very worryingly wrong. You know, what we have to say as journalists, what we have to teach as journalism teachers, is that narratives are always conflicted. There's always multiple narratives. There's always multiple perspectives on a story. That doesn't mean alternative facts, but it means alternative viewpoints and interpretations and understandings. And what journalists have to take on board very deeply and fundamentally is that you're reporting a contested narrative. It may be nice to have a simple black and white, easy, uncontested narrative, but it doesn't make for good journalism. And that was the practice in the Sunday Times. And it was a deeply, deeply flawed journalistic attitude.
And what I found so useful in that approach that you take is that you highlight the fact that those alternatives are not a burden, but an enrichment, that you seek out other ways of seeing other accounts that actually enriches the story that you tell. Pippa, I think this one may be best directed at you. There's a question here from Trudy du Toit from Sports Trader magazine. She says, once a media house like Media 24 posts a story online, it remains there forever. Even though the allegations in the story were found to be untrue, is there anything an ordinary member of the public can do to have such a story removed or an addendum added that the facts are incorrect? Pippa?
Thank you for the question, Frans and Trudy. You know, we have before, not necessarily in rulings, but the public advocate has negotiated for stories to be either corrected with a line on top if they're on the internet. Particularly, you know, it's a problem if there's someone's charged with a criminal offense and then they appear in court and they get acquitted or the charges are dropped. Often a story is not updated. I think it's a function of stretched newsrooms, but it's kind of important to update it and correct it. The public advocate has quite frequently negotiated that, or there will be a ruling. And if there is a problem, I mean, even if it's old, we do have a rule that the story's got to be within a certain amount of time. If there is a problem, then I would, you know, just get in touch with our office and we'll see if we can, you know, if once we've verified that the facts are not correct, we can try and get Media 24 to update it if somebody's been unfairly tarnished.
So, Frans, I wanted to add something to what Anton said about not the black and white, and that doesn't make for a good journalism. I agree with that strongly. And I think it's something in the space of reimagining, although it was always rather simplified when journalism developed, the notion of both sides of the story. We now know in developed that both sides of the story might just differences and not capture the differences that are more broadly present in society. That is in many countries. When the two main political forces have lost elections and new other forces have created coalitions and emerged, and you couldn't dictate that in the journalism. And also who fell foul of this was post on, which dictated a ground shift from voices from the ground and voices from the citizens. What Anton says is very important, and we might journalism forward, which is more sophisticated, interesting. many sides of the story. And your target really is what are the of the story that are not immediately apparent in appears to be. Because contestation of the elites is not new. And elites do some parts as they go on. And then they do their own negotiations and agree on things that are not in the best interest of the rest of the society. So I think an interesting journalism, given that there are so many multiple sources of information now, which need not just to be double-checked, to be treble-checked, is many sides of the story and where impetuses for a new society could emerge.
Yeah, I think that's those are valuable points. I mean, I suppose the world we operate in is just increasingly complex, and the future is uncertain, and the perspectives on the present and the future are more and more uncertain. There's a comment here from Kate Skinner. We have a few more minutes. She says, thanks for a great discussion. The financial situation in the media sector is dire and it impacts on ethics, fact-checking, etc. Is there any role that government should play in supporting the media sector? And if yes, what should that be? Okay, that could keep us busy for another hour or so. Tawana, do you want to have a first shot at that? What role should government play in supporting media?
Now, assuming that one is a credible government which doesn't have an intention of influencing how the media reports even on its own programs, there could be, in some countries, albeit there are societies that everybody thinks are a little strange, quote unquote, but in Scandinavian countries, commercial media gets subsidies in order to maintain media diversity. Talking to my colleagues, where, as you know, I did my PhD, they are now trying to change the policy so that all of those who produce credible information, including online media sites, can also receive those kinds of subsidies. But it's always a contested thing about whether you might not allow through the back door influence of or on the media agenda itself. But if it's a government that is credible and does anything, it knows that public money is held in trust, is not to influence itself. So because the commercial model is not going to work and is not working and there's deleterious effects, which is not to say everything that goes wrong or went wrong at the Sunday Times was because of the financing and commercial pressures.
Yeah, and I think, you point to the Nordic model, and I think one of the interesting observations that I've been thinking about recently is that actually there are similar models directed at community media in South Africa, in Canada, New Zealand and other places. And that is also a model for public support for particular sectors of the media, which one could draw into the picture. We're kind of out of time, but I do want to just, I suppose, ask Anton a last question. Ultimately, is this book a pessimistic one or an optimistic one about about journalism, or is that the wrong question?
It's mixed, because I do see great positives in the quality and depth of much of our investigative journalism. I highlight that some of our best journalism is coming from standalone, independent, grant-funded or philanthropically funded specialist units, not conventional newsrooms. And I think that there's a lot of hope that coming from the fact that they're producing some of our best journalism. So we have to weigh up our bad journalism against our good journalism. Fortunately, we have some very good pockets of journalism. So it's neither pessimistic or optimistic. It's an attempt at realism, saying we have to deal with the bad journalism, of which there's much too much. We have to build the good pockets of journalism, and we have to face up to the harsh realities of the transition in media we're going through and the changes we need to make in our journalism to deal with that.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for a most interesting discussion. We have recorded the discussion and it will be posted on our website, journalism.co.za. If anybody wants to look to go back to anything. Thanks to everyone who participated. I can't resist pointing out that this very interesting book of Anton's, which, as we said at the beginning, is available from leading and non-leading booksellers, is the fourth that has come out of our program this year. We've also seen Babel Unbound, Rage, Reason and Rethinking Public Life, edited by our colleague Leslie Cowling, together with Karen Hamilton. We've seen Femicide in South Africa, which came out of a PhD by Nechama Brody. And we've seen Women in Solitary, which grew out of a master's research project by Shantini Naidu, buy and read them all. So thanks very much. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to everyone who listened in and participated in the discussion. Thanks also to Tsepo Chabalala, who's kept us going in the background. Have a good rest of your Wednesday. Remember that AIJC, the African Investigative Journalism Conference, is running with many, many more interesting sessions to tune into. Have a great day and week, and we'll continue the conversation elsewhere.